Welcome back to Fintigrated, the podcast where we talk about what's really happening beneath the numbers. Because growth isn't just about revenue, it's about systems, it's about decisions, and most of all, it's about people. I'm your host, Christy Barber, and today's episode is all about family business succession planning, as it is probably one of the most emotionally complex topics that comes up in business, and it deserves more than a surface level conversation. So I come from a fourth generation family business, and walking away from it was a difficult decision that I made years ago. And it wasn't because I didn't care or I didn't believe in the business, but it really came down to I just saw there were different avenues for me to go. And a lot of times, what is difficult is it gets tied to your identity. So, this episode isn't about blame. It's not about who's right or who's wrong. It's about patterns. It's about expectations. And it's about the conversations most families avoid or still avoiding. And if they still do avoid them, costs more than actually having them. So, if you're part of a family business, or advising one, or quietly wondering whether you still fit inside yours, this episode will probably hit closer to home. So with that, there's a saying about family businesses. You've probably heard it, you've probably seen YouTube or TikTok videos around it, is the first generation builds it, the second generation grows it, the third generation maintains it, and the fourth generation comes in to figure out what should be next and to clean up some messes that the third generation, can sometimes get a little lazy around. For a long time, I thought that saying was just a joke, a little bit cynical, but over time, I realized something uncomfortable. It really wasn't a joke, it's a pattern. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it because suddenly a lot of things start to make sense. Why change feels harder with each generation, why risk tolerance shrinks over time, why innovation starts to feel threatening instead of exciting. The first generation takes massive risk because there's nothing to lose. The second generation builds systems and processes to protect what was created. The third generation will inherit that stability and they're learning how to maintain it, but they're also trying to, maintain how best to do things. By the fourth generation, the business carries more emotional weight than operational clarity. Those decisions aren't just around strategy or margins, they're about honoring the past, protecting the family name, not being the one who, messed it up. And when that pressure exists, change can feel dangerous, not because it's bad, but because it feels disrespectful. And this is where succession problems usually start. Not with incompetence, not with bad intentions, but with expectations that were never spoken out loud. So I want to say something really clearly is you can love a family business deeply and still realize it's no longer aligned with who you are. I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because I cared enough to be honest with myself. This business was my family's legacy. It was generations of work and sacrifice and pride. And so walking away wasn't a single decision. It was a slow realization where I could see opportunities for growth, opportunities to maybe modernize some of the way and systems that we were using, to tighten processes, to prepare the business for a different future. But leadership saw something else. From their perspective, the business worked. It had survived downturns, it had supported families, it had proven itself over decades. So when I talked about change, what they actually were hearing wasn't opportunity, they were hearing criticism. And this is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in family business. When the next generation pushes for change, it can feel like rejection to the generation that built it. And when that emotional layer isn't acknowledged, conversations stop being productive. They begin to become personal. and add in, the family dynamics on top of that, and holidays and history. And the tension doesn't stay contained. It shows up everywhere, in meetings, in silence, in side conversations, in the things that never quite get said. And eventually I had to confront something hard. Staying was costing me clarity, and it was also costing me, different things with health. It costs, confidence and alignment. And I realized that leaving wasn't quitting. Leaving was choosing a path where I could grow in a different environment. And I think that was the biggest thing, is in those moments, it felt like I was quitting and giving up on something because I wasn't willing to, get kicked while you're beaten down, per se. But fast forward that, of seeing now from a perspective that it was the best thing that could have happened. So here's one thing I want to ask you all listening, is what I wish someone had asked me earlier. And that is, who are you if you're not the successor? The family business gives us a little bit of a pre-written identity. We're not just an employee. We're not just a leader. We are the future of what's coming. We're the next generation. We're the ones who are supposed to take over. So when that path doesn't fit, it can sometimes feel like betrayal, not because of the business, but of the story. And so when I left, I didn't just leave a role. I left a little bit of an identity and had to rebuild that from scratch, which can be uncomfortable because we all get tied up into our work. It becomes who we are, whether, that's healthy or not. There's a lot of different things around it. And you can even see it with sports. If you were an athlete your whole life and then you're not an athlete anymore, we all go through these times that are uncomfortable, of we were this and now we have to become, something different that's in alignment with the next part of our lives. And so I left, and it was, like I said, it was uncomfortable. There was some hard feelings and different things like that, because I thought that was my story. But the thing was, I didn't know that there was so much more out there, and a different role for me, and something that would be so fulfilling and giving me ways to experience working in a business that I'd never had. And while I worked a few different jobs, I eventually started my own consulting firm. And now I work with companies doing tens of millions in revenue, many of them family owned. So helping them navigate growth and systems and leadership transitions. I sit on the outside and I watch the same patterns repeat. Avoided discussions, undefined readiness, emotional resistance disguised as logic, succession planning. So it isn't primarily a business issue. It really is an identity issue. And most family businesses don't fall dramatically. They erode slowly because the hardest conversations keep getting postponed. Founders worry about losing control, and those next generation leaders worry about damaging relationships. So then there gets to be silence because the strategy. But silence doesn't preserve harmony. It actually creates confusion at times because assumptions replace clarity. You're getting resentment that is replacing trust. And here's the dangerous part. Everyone thinks they're protecting the relationship, when in reality, they're slowly weakening it. The family businesses that successfully transition across generations make a different choice. They choose short-term discomfort over long-term damage. They're talking early, they're talking clearly, they talk honestly, even when it's awkward, and especially when it's awkward. Let's slow this down for a second. Let's look at it because this is where most families get stuck. These are the questions every family business must answer, whether intentionally or by default. Number one being, is the next generation actually ready? Not ready by age, ready by preparation. Because readiness means exposure to decision making. ownership of outcomes, learning from mistakes without being shielded from them. And here's the part people avoid. What does ready mean in this business? So if readiness isn't defined, it becomes political. And as we know, politics destroy faster than incompetence ever will. Now let's talk about the other side. Are current leaders prepared to step back? This is rarely talked about, honestly, because when your identity is tied to what you built, letting go is extremely emotional. Pretending it's purely logical only makes it harder. And a lot of people like to sit in the, oh, yep, I'm good with this. I don't have any emotions tied to it. It's just what it has to be. But there's so much emotion tied to it that it makes it so much more difficult. Why is everyone really here? Is it passion, obligation, or security? Or maybe it's none of these. And none of the motivations as to why you're there are wrong, but pretending they don't exist creates misalignment. And how does the business handle underperformance? This, I think, is the hardest issue in family businesses. Clear standards. Don't remove love. They're removing confusion. You need professionalism. It isn't cold. It's respectful. And then there's the question people are afraid to ask. Should the business stay in the family? This question scares people. And not every generation leader wants the same future. Acknowledging that early protects relationships and value. So here's the hard truth I had to learn. Seeing problems isn't enough. The next generation has responsibility too. Credibility is built through execution and asking yourself, what have I actually built? What have I implemented? Where have I taken ownership? What mistakes have I learned from? And then critique without execution. So it can sound like criticism, it's execute, build trust. But every family reaches the same fork in the road. Do we evolve or do we protect what exists? Preservation, it isn't wrong, but preservation without evolution becomes stagnation. Markets are shifting. We see this all the time. There's new technology coming into the place. There's new strategies. Your customers are changing. The systems you may be using today are aging out. So the reframe, this is where this matters. When the next generation pushes for change, they're rarely rejecting the past. They're trying to protect its value. So in a world that no longer looks the same, because so much is changing, and it could be the prior generation, they're seeing things as how it was. And as we all know, technology wasn't moving as quickly, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. It's more so since the 90s that technology has really sped up and it's ever changing. And when you're not exposed to certain things, how do you tend to keep that up and stay at the forefront of your industry and keep your customers staying? So before we close, I want you to sit with this. If you're part of a family business, ask yourself, what conversation are we avoiding right now? That if handled with intention, you could make it actually strengthen both the business and the relationships. So sit with that, because clarity doesn't come from silence, it comes from courage. In family business succession planning isn't about timing, it's about conversations. And every generation wants what's best. We just see the path differently. And there's legacy. It isn't preserved by silence, it's preserved by intention. And there's so many nuances to look at when you're, building a family business, you're handing it off. There's a lot in there. And so I have a blog that I wrote about this in a lot more detail of how you're navigating relationships within the family business, how to look at, do we let in-laws in? Do we keep it, blood relatives only? What does that look like? There's no wrong strategy. You just have to be clear on what that strategy is and what those rules are. because you don't want to implement one way and say, yep, everybody's welcome at a board meeting. The next one, no, why is everybody here? You're not welcome. And so the article goes into a lot more detail on that. So share it with someone that's, navigating a family business right now, and even this episode. And if you have more questions around, family operated businesses and just dealing with the nuances of that, feel free to reach out. Always happy to have those conversations. But make sure you're subscribed to Fintigrated, so that you're up to date with every episode that comes out, because we all know that there's a lot out there with small businesses, and I just want to make sure that you all are informed and you're getting a lot from this. And so I appreciate you all for listening, and I will